take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma. May I attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Action. My plan this afternoon is to begin with a very, very brief summary of some of the topics I covered this morning, and then to address some of the questions that were left at the end of this morning's session, and then to continue through my march. So this morning I mentioned that we were going to be spending a great deal of our time on the Yogacara tradition, because the Yogacara tradition I see as complementary, not competing with the Madhyamaka tradition, not a lesser doctrine, but rather a complementary doctrine, looking at emptiness from the side of the subject as opposed to the side of the object. And I suggested that in doing that, we try to put aside some of the traditional doxography while making use of it where we can in order to collect texts and interpret them, but not necessarily to prejudge the interpretations that we're going to find of the text that we look at. I also suggested, and I'll come back to this point in terms of the questions, that while Yogacara is most often, though not always, treated as a form of idealism, that is, as a doctrine that privileges the mind over the body, and that takes the mind somehow to be truly existent and the external world to be merely imaginary or non-existent, that may be not the most profitable way to understand the philosophy of the Yogacara tradition, and that we might do better thinking of it as a kind of phenomenology, that is, as an investigation into the cognitive structures and the cognitive processes that enable us to experience the world as we do. That is an investigation of the way in which the mind itself contributes to the emptiness of phenomena. And I pointed out, finally, that we were going to be moving towards a notion of non-duality, that non-duality is in various forms is common to many Buddhist traditions, but in the Yogacara tradition, the form of non-duality with which we're most concerned is subject-object non-duality. And that's because when we posit a duality of subject and object, we very often end up, well, we necessarily end up privileging the subject and creating the roots of egoism and self-grasping that are at the very foundation of samsara. And so one of the reasons for pursuing this philosophy is to attempt to cut off the roots of samsara by cutting off the roots of ego grasping, by cutting off the very idea of subject-object duality. And that's roughly what we accomplished this morning, though of course we did it in a little bit more detail than I have just done now, but that's at least a quick recap of where we've got to. Now, a few questions were necessarily left at the end of this morning's session, and I want to spend a little bit of time on those questions because I don't want to leave anybody behind or leave anybody out. And in doing that, I want to remind you, please interrupt me whenever there are questions, objections. I'll be watching the Q&A window as we go, but I'll also be watching the Abbey for hands and violent objections and objects thrown at the camera and things like that. So please feel free to do that. It will make things a lot more fun and will also allow for a lot more clarity because I am pretty good at obfuscating and because Zoom is not necessarily the most easy way to keep in touch with how people are actually following what I'm doing. So you can help me by being really explicit about those things. Let me just quick ask for a show of thumbs up or down from the Abbey right now. Is the pace at which I'm moving so far okay, or too fast or too slow? Thumbs up means it's okay. Thumbs down means I need to ask whether it's too fast or too slow. Thumbs equal, down, thumbs down, too fast or too slow? Too fast or too slow?
Too fast.
Too fast, okay. So I should go a little bit slower. Good. I need that kind of feedback because Zoom is a very funny way to teach and you can never quite tell what's going on. Okay, so we're going to go in a bit more leisurely pace with a little bit more detail and clarification then. And if I get to the point where I'm going too slow, then you can just fall asleep, and then I'll know that I should go a bit quicker to wake you up. Now that will be my cue. Okay, so let me begin with the questions that I left unanswered, only because we ran out of time. And one question, which I believe actually comes from Damshala, says, when we study the mind and awareness in Lorik, that is said to be epistemology. And how is that different from what I described as phenomenology? So that's a really nice question and takes us to nice ways of carving up the terrain and a little bit of translation issues and things like that. And the answer is yes, sort of, but not quite, which is a very helpful answer. So I'm going to try to make that a little bit plainer now. When I think, if I were to translate Lorik, which I'm about to translate now, I would translate it as psychology. So when I think of what we study in the Lorik tradition, we're studying the kinds of cognitive states and processes, mental events, and so forth that characterize our mind, and the relations of causality and dependence among them. And I think of that as a Buddhist psychology more than anything else. On the other hand, it's true that that overlaps with epistemology. I think of Sema as epistemology, Pramana studies as epistemology. And as you know, in the Tibetan tradition, and in particular the Gelut tradition, there is a great deal of overlap between the topics and the issues that we study in Sema and in Lorik, in epistemology and in psychology. And that's not surprising, because after all, if we're concerned with how our minds know things, well, we need to know about our minds, and we need to know about their relationships to objects of knowledge. But for me, the closer we get to thinking about questions of knowledge and justification and warrant, the more we're in epistemological terrain. And the closer we get to thinking about how the mind is actually working and the causal relations among cognitive states and the classification of cognitive states, that is Lorik, I think that we're moving more towards psychology. I'd like to distinguish both of those enterprises from phenomenology. Psychology is really telling us the kind of causal facts, kind of natural history of the mind. Tibetan and Indian psychology, of course, is a little bit different from experimental psychology in the West, but not all that different in its purpose. It's trying to figure out what the structure of the mind is and how it works, using the means that were available to classical Indian and Tibetan prospectors of the mind, which are different from those associated with in contemporary cognitive science, where we've got laboratories and apparatus and things like that. When we do epistemology, the traditions converge quite a lot. We're trying to think about what's justificatory, how we know, what we can know, what the relationship is between objects of knowledge and instruments for obtaining knowledge, wondering the way in which perception and inference work together, testimony, analogy, and so forth. What constitutes a good argument? What constitutes a bad argument? Those are all epistemological questions, questions about the structure of knowledge. But when we think about phenomenology, which is where we're going to be focusing as we talk about Yogacara, we're really asking the question, what's the structure of our experience? So we're not asking so much about the relationship between justification and knowledge. We're not asking about what constitute good arguments. We're not asking about entailment relations, kyat or vyapti relations. We're asking instead, what's the basic structure of the way we experience ourselves and the way we experience the world around us? And what does the mind have to be like in order to engender that structure? So it's a more philosophical exploration than Lorik is, which is more psychological, and an exploration that is more descriptive than prescriptive, unlike Sema or epistemology, pramana study, which is very prescriptive. So in that way, these three are closely related, but they're looking at mental processes, the mind and knowledge from slightly different perspectives. I hope that's going to become clearer as we go, but feel free to keep pushing me on that and making me clarify that distinction as we go. I should forewarn that those waters will get muddier a little bit later. And the reason they'll get muddier is because, as many of you know, the pramana or tsema tradition, the epistemological tradition in Buddhist philosophy, grows out of Yogacara philosophers. Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who are the progenitors of the pramana tradition, the epistemological tradition, are themselves both Yogacarans. And so there's a connection between Yogacara thought and their epistemological thought, but not all Yogacarans are as concerned with epistemology as they are. For instance, Vasubandhu and Asanga, that's not their main preoccupation. But when we move into Dignaga much later, we'll see the way in which that phenomenology and epistemology come together. Brett Mayhew asked the question, to understand suffering, should we take an existentialist viewpoint? Well, you might, but there are a lot of viewpoints you can take to understand suffering. Existentialism provides only one, and it's a useful viewpoint. But actually, I'd like to stick within a Buddhist viewpoint to understand suffering for these talks and kind of set the existentialist tradition to one side. And to say that when I think about suffering from the Buddhist viewpoint, we are thinking about the familiar three levels of suffering. The suffering, the ordinary, evident, apparent suffering of pain and reactions to external circumstances, the suffering of change, and the suffering of pervasive conditioning. And when we put those together, the basic insight is that the world we live in is a world that is profoundly unsatisfactory. It's unsatisfactory because bad things happen to us, because we can't always get what we want, because we often end up with what we don't want, because we get old and we die, because pleasures become unpleasant after a while, and because even though it would be a wonderful thing to be totally in control, we are actually parts of a great web of dependent origination. And most of our lives, all of our lives, are governed by causes and conditions over which we don't have ultimate control. Suffering is that. It is an existential situation. That is, it's the existential situation in which we find ourselves, where we find ourselves in a world pervaded by sources of suffering at all three of these levels. But the diagnosis that we have, that we operate with in the Buddhist tradition, is a slightly different one from a diagnosis that we find in the Western existential tradition. And I don't want to take us onto a long detour into existentialism. That's not what we're here to do. But just to say that I want to focus and take for granted the Buddhist analysis of our existential condition. That's the analysis that motivates Yogacara. That's the analysis that motivates all of Buddhist philosophy. In any Buddhist tradition, we begin with the Four Noble Truths. And in any presentation of the Four Noble Truths, we begin with the first. And when we begin with the first, to my mind, the deepest aspect of it is the third aspect, the suffering of pervasive conditioning. The fact that even though it would be really cool to be in control, we aren't. I hope that answers the question. The next question that was remaining, well, there were a couple. One question was this from Karen Hamilton. Isn't the value of Yogacara thoroughly understanding that all we have to go on are our own projections, that the mind never reaches an external object? Well, maybe, maybe not. I'd like you to hold the question, what's the fundamental insight of Yogacara, until we've gone through more Yogacara. And then I'd like you to ask yourself, what's the fundamental insight of Yogacara? I think there's a lot of fundamental insights in Yogacara. I wouldn't identify any one of them, but in particular, I would not suggest that what Yogacara is really about is assigning a special status to the mind. I'm going to suggest at the very end that everything that any Yogacharan says about external phenomena, we say about the mind as well. So hold on to your thoughts on that and ask that question again. Let's leave the big questions like that till we've seen a little bit more. I'm jumping through a few of these that I also think need to wait till the end. And those are the questions of Rashika and Ariane. Well, let me talk about Ariane's for a minute. Ariane asks the question, if I turn my back on something, does it no longer exist? Well, you can try this. I just invite you to do it. Face your computer screen, turn your back, and see whether it still exists. My guess is that it does. I don't think you're that powerful. I don't think that your face is what brings things into existence. I mean, perhaps you are. I don't know you all that well, only through this question. But for me, I know that a lot of things exist behind me. Sometimes they tap me on the shoulder. Sometimes if they're my dogs, they sort of paw me on the leg, and they're very much behind me. I really think you should resist any account of the relationship between the mind and the world that gives you as a subject that much power. That's the royal road to idealism. That's the royal road to thinking of yourself as the eye in the middle of the visual field. And if you are capable of bringing things into existence and out of existence by turning your head, you've got a lot more power than I have. Actually, if you can do that, I would like you to teach me that trick, because there's a lot of things I would love to take out of existence. And if I could do it by turning my back, I would do it in a minute. So I would just say, hold that thought as well. B asks a really deep question and asks it very concisely. B asks, how can we appreciate a process that reaches faulty conclusions? That is actually a very profound question. And I want to make a little bit out of that question, because we're going to encounter it in spades when we move into epistemology later. As human beings, we have these very faulty instruments for understanding the world: minds, sense capacities, and so forth. We know that our senses are really faulty, especially those of us who get old enough to need glasses. Because right now, you know what I can do? I can turn you all into blurs. There. Now you've all become very blurry. Now I've sharpened you up. That's kind of like turning my back on things. And I know that it doesn't have anything to do with my eyes that the world has changed. I know that my eyes are faulty instruments. I also know that my ears are faulty. I don't hear everything there is to be heard. And I know that my mind is faulty. I don't draw correct inferences all the time. I don't think clearly all the time. I don't even do arithmetic correctly all the time. I make all kinds of mistakes. I forget things. I may be alone in this, but I don't think I am. I think that we all approach the world with faulty instruments. That is the human condition. We are imperfect. That's actually also a fundamental insight, as we're going to see, of the Yogacara tradition. And it's an insight that I think is underappreciated by people who think deeply about Buddhist philosophy, but is one of the deeper insights of the Buddhist tradition. Our minds are faulty instruments. So whenever we use them to investigate the world or to investigate our minds themselves, we're using a faulty instrument. That's a drag. I mean, it would be nice to be infallible. It would be nice to be omniscient. That'd just be wonderful. But most of us aren't there yet. And so what that means is, whenever we do epistemology, we have to ask ourselves just what the limitations are of our own investigations. Anybody who tells you that he or she can look inside and see exactly how her mind works, you need to ask her, is your mind really that perfect, and you know that it's that perfect? If it is, you probably didn't need to investigate it in the first place. But if you needed to investigate it to find out how it works, you probably don't know that much about it. And if you don't know that much about it, you don't know whether it delivers you truth or falsity. As I sometimes like to say, you have to know whether you're looking through a telescope or a kaleidoscope in order to know whether what you're seeing is real. And if you don't already know the nature of your own mind completely, you don't know whether it's a telescope or a kaleidoscope. So all I can say is we do the best that we can. Chandrakirti, who's always one of my great favorites in the Indian tradition, probably my favorite philosopher, has a really nice analogy when he thinks about the way in which the different pramanas and the prameyas, the different instruments for gaining knowledge and the objects of knowledge work together. He says it's like when you stack sheaves of wheat together. None of them is foundational, but when you put them all together, they hold up the stack. And I think that it's like that with our admittedly faulty epistemic resources. When we put them all together, they help us converge on the truth, but they don't do it perfectly. But the best we can do is use imperfect devices to calibrate and to adjust other imperfect devices and make the progress that we can. Some of those devices are the texts that we read. Some are the teachers on whom we rely. Some are our own reflections and investigations and our own sense perceptions. None of these individually is perfect, but to the degree to which they corroborate each other, we've got a little bit more confidence in each of them. But if what you want is an ultimate foundation that's going to give you the world just as it is, then what you need is Buddhahood, not ordinary epistemic practices. That's tragic, but that's part of what samsara is. And that's part of the nature of suffering. And I thank you for that question, B. It's a really important one. And it's one, the answer to which I try to bear in mind at almost every moment in my life, because the temptation to think that you've acquired certainty, that you've really seen the truth, that now you know how it is so overwhelming so many times. And in my own experience anyway, every time I thought I've known something, I've been wrong. And so I try to keep that together. I think my mind is much more like a kaleidoscope than a telescope, but that's just how it goes. On the other hand, kaleidoscopes are fun. So, you take what you can get. Blaine Snow asks, is it Mahayana all about non-duality when properly understood, non-metaphysical or beyond metaphysics? Yeah. This is a discussion that goes on for a long time. There's a respect in which Madhyamikas are doing metaphysics and a respect in which they're not. And I'm going to get to that when we get to Madhyamaka. But in a thumbnail, it's like this. If you think that the task of metaphysics is to give you the fundamental nature of reality, then since the central idea in Madhyamaka is that there is no fundamental nature of reality, you can see Madhyamaka as wagging its finger at you and saying, stop trying to do metaphysics, right? On the other hand, that is a kind of metaphysics. You want to know what the fundamental nature of reality is? It's to have no fundamental nature. That's the emptiness of emptiness. And so the Madhyamaka project is a metaphysical project. And we can understand it as coming up at the end and saying, the real metaphysical insight is that there's no metaphysical insight. All of that's deeply paradoxical and hard, but that's where we go when we go to the emptiness of emptiness. And I don't want to go any further into that right now, but when we get to Madhyamaka at the end, that's where we'll go, I promise. And that's some of the hardest stuff in Buddhist philosophy. Really interesting, and it's really profound. And I always say to people, if you think you understand Madhyamaka, and you don't feel vaguely nauseated, then you probably are wrong. Madhyamaka should leave you with a sick, queasy feeling in the pit of your stomach, as though you're falling off of a great cliff, as the Japanese philosopher Hakuin puts it. And if you're not falling off that cliff, then you think there's something under your feet, some ground. Madhyamaka is all about the fact that there's no ground. And that's how it is. We just recited the Heart, now I'm off on a tangent, but I like tangents. We just recited the Heart Sutra together. And there's that one line in the middle of the Heart Sutra that I never really understood till I read Hakuin. And that was the line, Bodhisattvas have no fear. And you wonder, well, what's that about? They're not scared of spiders or bees or things like that. And you realize the deep insight there is that living as a bodhisattva is to live in free fall. It's to live with no ground and no foundation. And that can be scary until you recognize that nobody's ever been hurt by falling. You only get hurt if you hit the ground. If there's no ground, there's nothing to be afraid of. but getting used to the idea that there's no ground is very, very difficult. Anyway, hold those thoughts till we hit Madhyamaka near the end. And that's the end of the questions that remain from this morning. We've hit them. There's a few more questions that have come along. One about Dharmakirti on rebirth that I'm going to leave for another time because I'm not going to be talking about rebirth at all during this entire week and a half unless I get forced to. And then there's a question from Taran Su. If Yogacara doctrine is largely phenomenological, how does it provide an account of subjective emptiness? Isn't subjective emptiness metaphysical? I'll come back to this once again. When we think about emptiness from the subjective side, I'm not talking about the emptiness of the subject. That would indeed be metaphysical, and Madhyamaka worries about that. I'm rather worried about the contribution of our subjectivity to the emptiness of all phenomena. And so this is really important. This is really hard. And it's clear to me that I went through it much too quickly this morning. So I'm going to go through it right now one more time, but a little bit more slowly. Is it okay if I do some repetition to really get at that idea of the difference between emptiness from the subject side and emptiness from the object side? Is that okay? Nobody will be too bored? Okay, good. So I'm going to pull out the most important metaphysical prop that I have today, and that's my apple. And when I look at the apple, whether I'm a Madhyamika or a Yogacaran, I want to end up seeing this apple, experiencing this apple as empty. And I want to experience it as empty of intrinsic identity. If I'm a Madhyamaka, if I'm a Yogacara, I'm going to understand that in terms of a series of kinds of emptiness to which we will introduce ourselves a little bit later tomorrow. But leave that part aside. The emptiness that we're interested in is always the emptiness of the apple. That's what I care about. But there are two ways to get to the emptiness of the apple, maybe more, but at least two. One way, I think the most familiar way to most of us, given our training, is the Madhyamaka way. When we investigate the apple in the Madhyamaka way, we look at the relationship between the whole apple and its parts. We look at the relationship between the apple and all of the complexes of which the apple is a part. We look at the relationship between the apple and its causes and conditions. And we look at the relationship between the identity of the apple and conceptual imputation. This is Chandrakirti's three different senses of emptiness, right? Emptiness in terms of dependence on parts and wholes, emptiness in terms of dependence on causes and conditions, emptiness in terms of dependence on conceptual imputation. And even though it will take some time later in our discussions together to talk about each of those in detail, I'm guessing that those are all familiar. And we might give all kinds of arguments for that. We might give arguments where we actually do something like the sevenfold analysis, looking for the core of the apple. The thing is, apples have cores, but you can still go further than that. That was a bad joke. I'm sorry. We could also use something like the neither one nor many argument. We've got many arguments that we deploy in the Buddhist tradition to demonstrate those. Each of those involves, though, focusing on the apple itself to discover its emptiness. That's emptiness from the side of the object. What Yogacara is going to do is something a little bit different. We're still going to be interested in the emptiness of the apple, that is, of the object of knowledge, but we're going to come at it from the side of the subject. We're going to ask how it is that I become aware of the apple, what structures my awareness of the apple, and why the apple is empty in what sense the apple is empty when I think about it from the standpoint of the kind of subjectivity that I have when I apprehend the apple. So in any case, whether we're Yogacharans or Madhyamikas, we think that when I know the apple, there's a relationship between the apple and my mind. The question is which direction we come from when we examine the emptiness. Do we begin with the apple itself, or do we begin with the mind that apprehends the apple? Yogacara will be distinctive in beginning with the mind that apprehends the apple and trying to understand the nature of our experience of the apple. That's what I mean by emptiness from the side of the subject. Now, when you think about it that way, then you can see, and I hope that by the end of this we will see. Now I'm only giving you a promissory note. This is just a promise. You will see that these are not inconsistent ways of proceeding any more than if I wanted to travel to Chicago and I said, how do you get to Chicago? And you folks say, well, you start by traveling east. And I say, no, you start by traveling west. And now we say, oh my God, Jay and the people of the Abbey disagree dramatically about how to get to Chicago. They think you go to the east and Jay thinks you go to the west. Time for a debate. We've got two schools of thought about Chicago. One school of thought is that Chicago's in the east. One school of thought is that Chicago's in the west. We've got to figure out which of these is true. That's insane, right? That's totally insane. What we say is we're looking at Chicago from two different perspectives, one from Spokane, one from Amherst. Now, I want to say that when we think about emptiness from the Yogacara and the Madhyamaka view, that's a good analogy. We're not asking whether apples are empty because of the facts about the apple or whether apples are empty because of facts about consciousness. We can approach the emptiness of the apple by starting with the apple or by starting with consciousness. We don't have to fight about which way we start. We can say there are two ways to get there. And if we can get there from both ways, just as by getting to Chicago from the west and Chicago from the east, I learn a really deep fact. You want to know the deep fact? Chicago is actually between Spokane and Amherst. That's a deep fact that I couldn't learn by just coming from Spokane or just coming from Amherst. Similarly, I can learn a deep fact about the emptiness of the apple. I can learn that that emptiness has both subjective and objective aspects if I approach it from both sides. And that's a really good thing. And I don't have to ask, just as I don't have to ask, is it better to go to Chicago from Spokane or better to go from Chicago to Chicago from Amherst? That's a dumb question, right? It's a really dumb question. It depends where you start. Similarly, I can ask whether, I don't want to ask whether it's better to approach emptiness from the Madhyamaka side or the Yogacara side. I want to say it kind of depends where you start, and they both get you to interesting places. Does that help a little bit more? I mean, it's programmatic because we haven't done it yet. All I'm doing is giving you promises about where we're going to go. But sometimes when you're planning a journey, it's a good idea to consult Google Maps first. And this is just the consultation of Google Maps, not the journey itself. That's important. Shantideva has a nice analogy for that at the beginning of Bodhicharya Avatara, when he's talking about two kinds of bodhicitta, aspirational and engaged bodhicitta. His aspirational bodhicitta is like knowing about the place because you've read the guidebook, and engaged bodhicitta is knowing about the place once you got there. This is just the guidebook part, but by the end, I hope that we kind of get there a little bit. That's the plan, or at least we get there analytically, even if we don't get there through a deep experience. I don't think we can accomplish that in 9 days, but we'll try. Okay. Now, that's right. I was looking at these. All right. Somebody wants me to give them a detailed explanation of a verse from the 20 verses, and I'm not going to do that. And the only reason, this is Sagar Rao, the only reason I'm not doing that is that's not a text we're going to be studying this week. And I don't want to take us off on a tangent. That's something you can email me about and we can talk on the side. That's not the business of this week. And Dennis Gonzalez says, what Western philosophy is closest to Buddhism? That's a very cool question. It depends which Buddhist ideas you're interested in. But I think that in general, if you like Madhyamaka, then the Western skeptical tradition, starting with Pyrrho and going through Sextus Empiricus and David Hume and Wittgenstein, has a lot to say that can be in profitable dialogue with Madhyamaka. If you're interested in Yogacara, then you might want to be working more with transcendental idealists, people like Berkeley and Kant and Schopenhauer. But I think that to draw sharp distinctions between Western and Indian philosophy is a mistake. It's one philosophical world, And my suggestion to anybody is read widely, think widely, talk to lots of people. Insights are all over the place and under lots and lots of rocks. So that's the Q&A stuff that's there so far. Now I think we're ready to continue. Are we ready, or are there more questions to answer from where we've gone so far? Yes, I see a question in the Abbey back by the window, backlit so I can't see who it is.
I just want to clarify to see if this is what you said in the morning. You were talking about phenomenology, and one descriptor you had, I think, was what kind of mind or what kind of relationship of mind and world can give this appearance as it is?
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. So we're asking the question, we're saying, wow, the world appears to me in this way. Here's how I experience it. What would my mind have to be like to produce that kind of experience? And what does that tell me about the relationship between my mind and my object? That's a nice question to ask, isn't it? And let me sharpen that question for one little bit, okay? I just want one little sharpening. I often like to do this. This is a kind of cognitive exercise inspired by the idea of the 6 realms. But it's a really useful cognitive exercise. I like to imagine being me in my room or in my world, being my dog in my world, and being a bee flying through my world. And this is just a very useful exercise. So I'm now going to talk you through a little bit of sensory psychology to give you a feel for why this is such a powerful spiritual exercise, not just a kind of idle daydream, but an important spiritual exercise. When we human beings see the world, we are very visually dominated. Our brain is really designed to take in visual information and give us a world. And so we all experience the world as volumes of colored, shaped things that might have smells, make noises, sometimes have tastes and things like that, right? But we experience things primarily as visual volumes. And so we live in a world full of visible objects that then have other properties. Dogs are really different. They've got these gigantic olfactory bulbs and very small visual areas. They experience the world as a volume of smells and gradients of smells and tastes. Those smells might look like something, sound like something, feel like something, but they're predominantly a world of volumes of smells. We can barely imagine that. A bee has got these really complicated eyes that are sensitive to ultraviolet and infrared light and all kinds of parts of the spectrum that we can't even imagine. And they're also oriented to electromagnetic fields. So they live in a world of electromagnetic fields and wildly different colors than we have. And now, so when my dog is in the room, he experiences all of these smells that might look like something. I experience visible things. The bee experiences magnetic fields and infrared radiation and all of that. Now imagine you ask yourself the following really stupid question. Who sees the world correctly? The bee, the dog, or the person? You know, as soon as you ask that question, how dumb it is, right? Instead, you've got to think there's a human world, there's a bee world, and there's a dog world. And each of those worlds shows up for its subject in a very different way. And we can ask of each of those minds, what does that mind have to be like for the world to show up that way, as opposed to another way? Then we're doing phenomenology. When we're asking, what are we doing to get the world to show up for us in a particular way? That's what Yogacara is doing. Why is that so important? Well, obviously it's important for us because our instinct is to say, well, the world just plain looks like this. That's what the world looks like. And we register it in our heads just as it is. My dog, I'm sure, thinks the same thing. And so does the bee who flies through the world. And we're all wrong about that. We're all right about how it appears. We're all wrong in thinking that that appearance has anything at all to do with how it is. The confusion of appearance for reality, the confusion of something that we made with our minds, with something that we found just as it is. That's what primal confusion is. That's the root of cyclic existence. So when I say this isn't just a kind of fun imaginative exercise, it's a spiritual exercise. It's an exercise that's aimed at reminding you that the world you inhabit is a world you made. When in the Buddhist tradition, we say the entire world is made from karma. That's what that means. The karma that gives me the body and the mind of a human being means I inhabit a human world. The karma that means my dog has the mind and body of a dog means that he inhabits a dog world. The karma that makes your cat inhabit a cat world is the karma that creates that cat world. None of us simply register the world as it is. We only register the world that we build. Somebody asked, what's the fundamental insight of Yogacara? That's it. And that's a very profound insight. And that's where we're going to be going. Does that help a little bit more to get at that idea of phenomenology and the question? Are we getting clearer? Good. Force me to be that clear. Make me go over things again and again. Because if you don't, then I'll just confuse you. And like I say, that makes me a bad teacher. And that's the worst thing I could possibly do. Snehi, who says, please explain the difference between the emptiness of dependent designation and subjective emptiness. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the phrase emptiness of dependent designation, but I will bet that what you mean is something like the imagined nature or the imputed nature, emptiness in terms of designation. And I want you to hold that question because we're going to get to that place very, very soon, but we're not there yet. You're running ahead of me because we're going to get there when we get to the three naturelessnesses or the three emptinesses in Yogacara that we won't get to till we get to the 7th chapter of the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, which we will get to after we get to the 6th chapter, which we will get to after I finish all the preliminaries. So we're on the way to answering that question, but I'm not going to jump that far ahead. Ellen Wolf asks a really good clarificatory question from about what I just said. She asks, we only register the world that we built. That's a quote from me. Can you speak further at some point about how we build that world? Is it of our own volition, for example? And I want to say definitely not our volition, at least not in the sense of volition that we use in the West. That is something done on purpose. If by volition you mean chaitana, then yes, chaitana is involved, but that's a very separate kind of idea. And I don't want to go there right now either. I do want to say that it's a kind of cognitive reflex, that we are wired, we are built, we have it in our genes to develop the kinds of sense organs, sense faculties, and sense consciousnesses, and the kind of mind that constructs the world that we live in. That's really important. That's what makes us human beings and makes it possible for us to talk to each other and interact with each other. If we didn't share enough of a world, we couldn't do that. We would be each living on our own strange universe. We don't do that on purpose. We do that because we're wired to do it. That's dependent origination. That's karma. That's what it is to live in a human body. We don't get to choose what we see. We see what we see. Blaine now pushes me and says, doesn't the dog, the bee, and me all share certain common features of the world? Water to me, the bee and the dog are not the same, or the solidity of a wall that none of us can pass through. And I think that's correct. As animals, we share our worlds share some features, but they don't share other features. For instance, the air for the bee affords a great way to travel, not for me and not for my dog. There are similarities and there are differences. To say that our worlds are different doesn't mean that everything is different, but it does mean that the fundamental way the world shows up is very, very different. Just imagine what it would be to live in a world of volumes of smells. Just imagine what it would be for sight to be a subsidiary way of knowing the world as opposed to a primary way of knowing the world. That's a very different world indeed. And Ellen asks whether the Buddhist path lets us deconstruct that wiring. Well, that's the hope. It may not let you escape it completely, but it may help you to at least to recognize it and to not take it at face value. There's a really nice phrase that's useful here in answering that question from Ellen. And it's a phrase that comes from the German philosopher Edmund Husserl. And he talks about the natural attitude. That is our instinctive attitude towards the world. Our natural attitude is that our senses deliver the world just as it is to our minds. So you want to know what the world looks like? Looks like that. We've just discovered that doesn't even make sense, right? You want to know what C sharp on an oboe looks like? Play it, it sounds just like that. Well, it does to me, but not to a dog or a bee, right? But the natural attitude is to think that the world just shows up for us as it is, as opposed to how we construct it. What we can do through careful Buddhist practice and analysis is to step behind that natural attitude and to come to take responsibility for and to recognize our own constructive activity. That takes work, though. That's not instinct. That's hard work and thinking. And that's what Yogacara is about. Notice, for instance, that the name Yogacara means masters of meditation. They don't think you do this just by doing 9 days of philosophy. They think you do it by doing a lot of meditation to really familiarize yourself, to really accustom yourself to thinking this way. I think that doing some philosophy, we can convince ourselves this is the right way to experience the world. But rewiring is a lot harder. That probably takes good, hard work over a very, very long period of time. Now, I see that Connor McCann is pushing me further on this, but I'm going to say, Connor, just wait. We're going to get there. I promise we will get there, and just hold on to that question. And within a few days, you can re-ask that question if it's still there. Deal? Deal. Well, you didn't agree, but I agreed. So now I'd like to continue and take us a little bit further, okay? Okay, so a couple of other important ideas that we're going to encounter in Yogacara that are going to be connected to what we're doing. And again, this is very preliminary, need a little bit of introduction. Like I say, this is the Google Maps version. We're just getting the big picture, and then we'll get into the details starting in a little while. And that the first is the idea of the Alaya Vijnana, Kunshi in Tibetan, translated in lots of different ways. I like to think of it as the foundation consciousness, or the fundamental consciousness, I think is even better. The idea of the Alaya Vijnana, or the fundamental consciousness, is articulated in many different ways in Yogacara texts through many different metaphors. And I don't want to kind of grind through all of the different metaphors and how to understand them. I want to make a pretty bald declaration right now that I hope that we can make good on as we go through this course. And that is that the best way to think of the Alaya Vijnana is just that set of unconscious cognitive processes that drive our conscious life. You can think about this if you want in a kind of, I don't know, Freudian way. People a long time ago, apparently, I don't know if this is true, believed that the mind was completely transparent. I actually can't believe anybody ever believed that, but that's the myth. And then Freud somehow disabused Europeans of that. I don't believe that for a minute. But I do know people who think that the mind is transparent, who think that they can simply look inside and tell how their mind works. I think if that were true, psychology would be an unnecessary science. Our minds are very complicated objects, and they involve a lot of processes that are completely opaque to us, that we cannot introspect, that are happening at a very, very low level or happening very, very fast, of which we're completely unconscious. For instance, we know this in visual perception when we know that our minds are constantly filling in the illusion of color in the periphery of our visual field. All of you know, I'm guessing, that only about the central 10% of your visual field has color receptors. The other part of it is all being received by your eye in black and white, but your brain is quickly filling in colors and giving you the experience of a uniformly colored field. you have a blind spot in the middle of your visual field where your optic nerve comes in, and your brain is constantly filling that in. If somebody were to ask you, introspect and tell me what it feels like to do that, how hard is it? What are you doing when you do that? You can't do that. That's unconscious processing. Sadly, some unconscious processing isn't so useful. For instance, most of us know now about implicit bias that many of us, probably all of us, experience in some way. An implicit bias comes from unconscious cognitive processes and can have terrible effects. So we know that our minds are doing a lot that we can't introspect. And when I read about Alaya Vijnana or Kunshi, what I'm thinking is that's that low baseline level of cognitive processing over which we don't have a whole lot of control consciously, that we're not aware of, that we can maybe understand a little bit more of, gain a little bit more insight into, but that is constantly bubbling up and determining our conscious cognition. I often think when I try to imagine the mind that our introspectable cognitive processes, the thoughts and the ideas, the experiences of which we're aware, are very much just like the waves on the ocean. We can see those, we're aware of those, but they're driven by wind and deep processes in the ocean that we can't see. So one of the things that Yogacara is on about is to remind us that the conscious experience that we have, even of our own minds, is only a tip of an iceberg. It's only a glimmer of what our minds are about. So to the extent that you think that your own mind is immediately available and transparent to you, Yogacaran philosophers are telling you, think again. Lots of that is happening at levels of which you cannot be aware. And maybe you can become aware of a little more of it, but there's always going to be depths that elude introspection. And then the last thing that I want to say that we're going to encounter before we start actually encountering things, this is the end of the preliminary explanations, if you want, are the two, I think, most central ideas in Yogacara thought, the ideas of the three natures, or Trisvabhava, and the three naturelessnesses, a word that is really hard to say 5 times fast, or the three Nisvabhavas. And most often when people think about Yogacara theory, they focus on those positive ones, the three natures. But I'm going to argue that the three naturelessnesses are absolutely equally important, and they're tightly coordinated with the three natures, because that's when we really make the connection to emptiness, is when we convert the three natures into three naturelessnesses. And we're going to start encountering the three natures very soon, and then gradually move our way into the three naturelessnesses. So to have a comprehensive view of Yogacara, what we've got to do is to imagine this doctrine of the Alaya Vijnana, of the storehouse consciousness, this idea of an emptiness of subject-object duality, and that all phenomena have the three natures and three naturelessnesses. And that's the picture that we're going after. That's the guidebook. My plan in our exploration of Yogacara is to begin with chapters 6 and 7 of the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, the Sutra Unravelling the Thought. And I see that you have John Power's excellent translation in front of you. That's the one that I'm going to be using, that we're going to be using. And it's very nice because it also has the Tibetan on facing pages. So you can make sure that you can see that John is being honest about this. I think it's a very good and fluent translation. And the sutra is absolutely foundational to Yogacara thought. As you probably all know, when Je Rinpoche wrote his great treatise on hermeneutics, Leksha Nyingpo, the essence of hermeneutics, he focused on how to read the Samdhinirmochana Sutra. And that's kind of nice because the Samdhinirmochana Sutra is in part about hermeneutics, and Je Rinpoche then turns it on itself and asks about what kind of way we should be reading the Samdhinirmochana. We won't be looking at Je Rinpoche's reading of it. We're just going to look at the sutra itself. But my hope is that after you've read, especially chapter 7, then you can go back to Leksha Nyingpo and read it with renewed interest and fun. After we talk about that text, We'll be talking about a very late text by Vasubandhu, and I'll put a footnote on that, uncertain authorship, called Trisvabhava Nirdesha in Tibetan Rangshin Tempa, the treatise on the three natures. And I think it's the most beautiful and poetic exposition of three nature theory and its relationship to Yogacara thought that I know of, and to non-duality. So we're going to do that little text, which I dearly love. And then, assuming that I haven't run out of time, I'd like to take you into some pramana theory as it develops within Yogacara, looking at Dignagas, Alambana Pariksha, that is the Nikpatakpa, the investigation of the percept, and that we can read along with some Tibetan commentaries to look at how a series of Geluk interpreters have taken a look at this particular Yogacara-inflected epistemological text. So we'll be looking at three different aspects of Yogacara literature as we look at that to try to get a fairly comprehensive picture. And we'll stay pretty close to the text, riffing and having fun philosophically with it, but really paying attention to reading and thinking about these texts together. Does that sound like fun? I hope. I mean, if you don't like textual work, you're in the wrong place, but you should like textual work. And these are all fun texts to read. And they're each literary masterpieces of their own in three very different genres. Okay. I've got two questions in the Q&A right now. And this is a perfect time because this is the moment when I had planned to take a break to take questions. So long, deep breath. I've bored you for a long time. I'll start with these questions that are in the Q&A, but also invite you to use this time to dream up really cool questions and to ask them, or objections or worries. So we take a little break from Jay just rattling on, and I'll interact a little bit more. Sagar Rao asks whether these kind of phenomenological arguments lend themselves to arguments from illusion that lead us to renouncing any knowledge of the external world altogether. You're right, Sagar, you can go in that direction with these, and a lot of people who argue for extreme forms of skepticism go in that direction. Leave the question open whether we have to go in that direction, and see where Yogacharans go with this one. But you're right. If what you want to do is to mount deep questions about the very existence of the external world, this is a great place to start. But that might not be where you want to go. So hold these big questions till we see some more of what actually happens. And then it might be a really nice time to raise those and to ask why Yogacharans don't go in that direction, or do they? Michael asks, when I talk about cognitive processes that are unavailable to us, is there a distinction between the brain and the mind? Wondering in this light of the idea in Buddhism that the nature of the mind is clear, how does the clear light nature of mind relate to the idea that the mind is not transparent? And those are two good questions. I think that we need to distinguish between mind and brain. We don't need to be dualistic when we do that, but we need to know that when we talk about the brain, we're talking about a physical organ. And it's a physical organ that is certainly involved in the production and maintenance of our mind. Here's an experiment you can try. Remove your brain. You will discover that you have no mind left. I do not recommend trying this at home, but I assure you that it would work. So your brain is an important physical support for your mind, but then so are lots of the rest of your body. That is, to think that the mind is simply identical with or located in the brain is to take a very oversimple notion of what the mind is and its relationship to the physical. I want to think about the mind functionally in terms of what it does, its ability to know, to experience, to act, to judge, and then to recognize that all of those capacities, all of those functions are subserved by a range of different other objects, and not worry too much about the metaphysics or the psychology or the neuroscience of how that goes. That's a topic for another day. But now the other question you ask, which is a very deep and important and sometimes contentious one, is the idea of luminosity. We often read that the nature of the mind is to be clear and luminous. And I want to now set aside the idea of a subtle, clear light mind, because that's not the mind we're talking about right now. But I do want to worry about the luminosity or the clarity of mind as its nature. It's, I think, easy to overplay that card. Here's what I mean by that. I think that the metaphor that's being used there is simply the metaphor of a lens or a window or a mirror. That is, that the mind is the function by means of which we know the world. And the luminosity or the clarity simply means that the mind is whatever it is that discloses that world to us. That when we're aware of the world, we're aware of the world through our mind. We're not aware of our mind and thereby being aware of the world. So that's the difference between a window and a movie screen. The nature of a window is to be clear and luminous. You look through it and you see the world outside. The nature of a movie screen is to be opaque. Something is projected on it from this side. And I really want to understand the idea of the luminosity and the clarity of the mind as meaning that the mind is more like glass. We use it to see what's beyond. But again, I want you to worry about that glass because, as you know, windows can be distorting. Windows can be convex or concave or rippled. And the world they give you isn't necessarily the world as it is. I think if you go from the idea that the mind is revelatory of the world to the idea that the mind gives us the world just as it is, then you've forgotten emptiness. And you think that somehow you've got direct, immediate access to the nature of things by using your mind. So I would just urge not to overplay that metaphor and not to go from the idea that the very function of mind is to reveal the world to the conclusion that it reveals it perfectly. Those are very, very different ideas. What is the Yogacara position on Buddha nature? I don't think there is the Yogacara position on Buddha nature. Buddha nature theory and theories of Buddha nature run through Buddhist traditions and vary wildly. Yogacaran philosophers, as well as other philosophers, have positions on Buddha nature. I'm going to steer away from Buddha nature in this course, just because I'm really trying to focus instead on these questions about the apprehension of emptiness and understanding emptiness in the subjective and the objective point of view. So I'm going to set that question aside, not because it's an important question, but because it's really not what I'm going to talk about in this course. That's its own topic and a really big one. Another question was, what do I think about the John Keenan translation of the Samdhinirmochana? It's perfectly good. I like the powers a little bit better, but it's mostly because I like the naturalness of the language a little better, and because it's got the Tibetan sitting right there. And for me, I love being able to look at the English and the Tibetan together so that if I wonder, John, does it really say that? I can look at the Tibetan and say, damn, you were right again. And I like that part. Or to say, not quite. So that's the only reason. But if you use the Keenan, you'll be perfectly, perfectly fine. John also asks a question about Buddhist and Western theories of the mind and the Alaya Vijnana. Can it be proven scientifically? I think if you think that the Alaya Vijnana is unconscious cognitive processes, absolutely. I mean, all of cognitive science tells us that our mind is driven by tons of unconscious processes. And to me, that's just Alaya Vijnana. It doesn't mean that everything that every Buddhist theorist said about Alaya Vijnana can be proven scientifically or is in fact even correct. But it does mean that if you think that to understand the mind, you have to understand the unconscious cognitive processes as well as the surface processes, I think there Yogacara and modern cognitive science are resoundingly in agreement with one another. That's why we bother doing experiments. Blaine Snow asks about the Thomas Cleary translation. I haven't really worked through that one, so I don't know, but Tom Cleary's a really good translator. So my guess is that it's just fine. But I haven't worked through that translation, so I can't vouch for it. But I think Thomas Cleary is an excellent translator. He would be translating from the Chinese version, not the Tibetan version. I think the versions are probably pretty close to one another, and I wouldn't worry at all about using that one. Keenan, Cleary, Powers are three excellent translators. I wouldn't think there's a lot of difference between them. Like I say, I like the Powers because of the naturalness of the language and because of the presence of the Tibetan right there. Okay. Sagar Rao again says, in order to avoid ontological primacy to the mind, do Yogacara philosophers have to throw out their own idea of appearance only at some level of analysis? Wait, be patient, wait till we get there. I'd really like some of these big, hard philosophical questions to wait till we've seen a little bit more text, and then we can ask those questions and answer them with a little bit nuance, a little bit more nuance. Until we have the doctrine of the three natures and the three naturelessnesses in front of us, then it's kind of hard to answer these questions specifically. And I don't want to jump ahead and try to give a thumbnail answer to a very deep question. I'm not saying these are bad questions. These are really good questions. But some of them are questions that I want you to hold just till we have more of the doctrine on the table. And I know it sounds like I'm being really mean, and probably I am, but these are questions that we'll be able to do a better job with when we have a little bit more out. Sorry, Sugar. Keep the question, just hold it for a couple of days, and then it's going to be a much more easy to address question. Any other questions? The box is open, is empty now. No more hands. Should we walk into the Samdhinirmochana? Okay, let's open the Samdhinirmochana then. And we're going to be beginning in chapter 6, the questions of Gunakara. But I first want to talk to you a little bit about the Samdhinirmochana Sutra as a whole, and just make a few general remarks about the text that we're reading. The text itself is lost in the original Sanskrit. We have Chinese and Tibetan translations of it. And was almost certainly completed in about the 3rd century of the Common Era. That's something that most scholars of this text agree on. But like many Mahayana sutras, it's a text which seems to have been assembled slowly over time from earlier versions. And some of the material in the Samdhinirmochana people think may date back as early as the 1st century of the Common Era. So to about the same time that the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were actually being completed. So there are some old parts of the text, but the text as a whole, most people think was assembled right around the 3rd century of the Common Era. By the way, just for those of you who care about these things, and not everybody does, but I do, when we think about Indian Buddhist texts, there's often, I don't know how to put this in a polite way, so I won't put it in a polite way, a fetishization of the original version or the oldest version or something, and then seeing later versions of a text as somehow degenerations or something like that, or corruptions, as people will sometimes put it. I think that's the wrong way to think about the history of Indian texts, and that very often what we call earlier versions are things that I would call more like rough drafts or partial drafts. And that very often the important text is the one that kind of coalesces later and becomes the subject of commentary. So for instance, I'm trying to imagine, if somebody in 1,000 years, this will never happen because I'm not very important, but were to say, oh, gee, we want to find out what the original version of one of Garfield's books was. And instead of looking at the version that I published, went back to my computer and found the earliest, ugliest rough drafts with marginal notes and me saying to myself, this won't work, you've got to redo this and so forth, and say, that's the actual version, everything else is a corruption. I think, no, you don't understand. Things start in very rough forms and then they evolve. And we forget that that's true of these texts as well. And that very often The sutras we know, the Mahayana sutras, were put together by compilers who were taking a kind of greatest hits of earliest rough drafts, putting them together and getting them into a kind of coherent whole. And the reason I say that is because notice that when we look at commentaries of the Samdhinirmochana, nobody's commenting on earlier drafts and versions. They're commenting on the version of the sutra that we have here in front of us. And another way of putting that is, again, if you care about textual history, which I care about, is that the life of a text in these scholastic traditions, and Buddhism is a scholastic tradition, is often in the commentaries and the sub-commentaries on the text. Indian Shastras, Indian Sutras are written to be commented on, and they're written in the anticipation of commentary. That's why so many of the root texts are such terse verse texts. They're not meant to be read just in the verses. They're meant to be read with commentaries. And so the version you'll want to find is the version on which people comment. And to look for earlier fragmentary versions, I think, is probably in general a mistake. So all of that's to say that what we've got here is probably a 3rd century text, but composed from some earlier material as well. And when I say that it's a 3rd century text, that's important to note because that locates it right at the very beginning of the rise of the Yogacara school and makes it a very important foundational text for that school. That's also really important to see. When I think about the Sutra foundation of Yogacara, I always think the big texts you want to look at are the Samdhinirmochana and the Lankavatara. As the texts that are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But the Samdhi has always been my favorite of those. And I teach it only for that reason, because I like to teach texts that are my favorites. The text is set up, every sutra has got a kind of concrete location ascribed to it. And the location ascribed here is some celestial palace somewhere. We don't know exactly where or exactly whose palace it was, but it's set up obviously in a mythical kind of landscape. And in this text, the Buddha is in Q&A mode. He's sitting around taking questions from really smart bodhisattvas. Kind of like I hang out here in question and answer mode sometimes, only I'm not a Buddha. But I at least have great bodhisattvas asking me questions. I just don't answer them nearly as well. So he's in Q&A mode, and what we have is the kind of record of the questions that are asked by these celestial bodhisattvas of the Buddha and the Buddha's answers. So that's the literary structure of the text. People kind of have a lot to say about, why the order of the chapters is where they are. I don't want to worry about that. I want to dive right into what I think of as the 2 most doctrinally important chapters, the 6th and the 7th. The 6th is focused on the 3 natures. The 7th is focused on the 3 naturelessnesses. And that's why we're going there. So the 6th is the questions of Gunakara. And Gunakara just means the origin of good qualities, right? Yuntenchungna. So I don't think the names are all that important in general, but they're kind of fun to know what they mean sometimes. Always remember, English names usually mean something too. It's not just Sanskrit names that mean something. But anyway, Gunakara means the origin of good qualities. And the question that Gunakara asks is a really kind of straightforward question. He says, Yo Buddha, you said that bodhisattvas are really wise, they're really smart about the characteristics of phenomena. That bodhisattvas really know what things are like. It's the way we put it in English. And he says, what did you mean by that? How are they wise in the characteristics of phenomena? Is it like that they really know which things are blue and which things are round? That they know which things taste good and which things don't taste good, right? He doesn't say that, but you can imagine the idea. There's all kinds of things you could mean. If I were to say, hey, I've got this friend who's really wise about the characteristics of things, you might say, what do you mean? In what sense is he wise about that? And the Buddha says, well, he's actually wise about 3 characteristics of phenomena, and that is the 3 natures. Now, I'm going to make an important grammatical point now that is a very, very important point to notice about the three natures. And you miss a lot if you don't see this. The Sanskrit terms for the three natures are parikalpata, paranishpana, and paratantra and parinishpana. Now, the first one, the imagined nature, is parikalpata. The last one, the consummate nature, parinishpana. But the middle one, the dependent nature, is paratantra. So you've got two different kinds of prefixes. And the prefixes indicate the kind of grammatical categories that we're talking about. And this is something that would be obvious to anybody reading it in Sanskrit. So the first and the third, the imagined and what I'm going to translate as the consummate, John translates it as thoroughly established, and he also translates the imagined as the imputed. And notice that everybody's got their favorite translations of these things. I'm going to use my favorite translations instead of John's. So let me repeat those again. I'm going to call the first one, what John calls the imputed nature, the imagined nature, kuntak in Tibetan, or kuntakpa, parikalpata in Sanskrit. For what John calls the other dependent nature, I'm just going to call the dependent nature, paratantra or shenwang. And for the third one, with the parinishpana, I'm going to use consummate nature, where John uses thoroughly established nature. Different translators have different styles and emphasize different things. And if you get used to reading Buddhism in English, you've got to get used to translating between translators. That's just how it is. Now, getting back to the grammatical point that I wanted to make. The first and the third are past participles. Imagined means the nature that has been imagined. The consummate or the thoroughly established means the nature that has been completed or consummated. It's a past participle. But the middle one, the paratantra, is a nominal construction. It just means something that is other dependent. It's not something that something's been done to, right? So, if you imagine the difference between talking about, here's a nice analogy. I'm trying to think of good analogies on the fly. Thinking about a construction. Construction is a past participle. It's telling you something's been constructed, that which has been constructed, versus a house, just a nominal idea, right? And it's very important when we're understanding the Samnita-mochana. This is something I just really want to emphasize. And the person who really developed this idea with great clarity is the great Japanese Yogacara scholar Gajin Nagao. But this is not original with me. I'm completely borrowing the work of Gajin Nagao here. But this is something that is just patently obvious in the Sanskrit, almost obvious in the Tibetan, because you've got takpa and dukpa, which are both verbs, past tense verbs in the first two, and you just got shenwang, right, through the power of another in the second nature. Not as obvious, but still pretty obvious, very unobvious in most English translations. So I want you to focus on this. When we think of the imagined nature, and we'll get to the natures in a minute, we're thinking about a way that things have been imagined, something the mind has done to them. When we think of the consummate nature, we're thinking of something that has been consummated, something that has been completed, something that we're kind of finished with. But again, it's something that something has been done to. But when we think about the other dependent, that's totally neutral. That's just talking about how things are. And you've really got to bear that in mind to see that the first and the third natures are of a very different order than the second nature. By the way, if there's one thing you take out of these 9 days together, take that out. That it's really important to understand that difference among the three natures. So that's the grammatical point. Any questions about that? Should I pause on that for a minute? Because that's hard technical stuff. It's not just grammatical, it's philosophical, because they're making points about how to think about these natures and connecting them to the mind. Question? Chinny, was that a question? Oh, you're muted.
To a question to elaborate that, so important that to repeat it with an elaboration would be helpful.
I will repeat it with an elaboration, I promise. So here's the idea. And thank you for that. That was a bodhisattva's question, because I'm sure that somebody else had that question too. So when we look, I want to do it first grammatically and then transfer that into a more metaphysical or phenomenological register. Grammatically, we're looking at the difference between a past participle and a simple description. So when I describe, for instance, something as having been constructed, that's different from describing it as a house, right? I'm talking about something that's happened in the past that brought it about. And when we look at the first nature and the third nature, the parikalpita in Sanskrit, or kuntak in Tibetan, and the parinishpada in Sanskrit, or yongdrut in Tibetan, those are both put in the past participle grammar. Whereas the middle nature, the so-called other dependent or dependent, paratantra or shenwang, is not past participle. That's just a nominal construction. So it's the difference between just talking about a thing, a way something is, versus something that's been done to it. Does that make sense? Now, you might think that that's just a boring feature of Sanskrit grammar that we don't need to care about. But what I'm foreshadowing is that it's more than a boring feature of Sanskrit grammar. It's pointing out that as we think about these natures, we're thinking about them in relationship to cognition, in relationship to the mind. And we're thinking about the way that cognition apprehends, represents, posits its objects. And so in the first case, we're talking about something that ordinary, untutored cognition does to objects. And we're talking about the last one, we're talking about what a more awakened cognition does to objects. And the middle one, we're kind of neutral between those two. That's what it's being done to. So kind of the forecast is that when you look at the dependent nature, there are two things you might do to it. You might parakalpify it, or you might parinishpify it. That is, you might imagine it to be one way, or you might consummate it, right? And it's really important to see those and to see, I like to think of the paratantra, the dependent nature, as a kind of pivot point between the other two. And this gets complicated because it's going to mean that it's weirdly Janus-faced. There's going to be a sense in which it's always merely conventional and a sense in which it's more than that. And we're going to be thinking about, if you want, the transition from parakalpifying it to parinishpifying it as a path move. Does that make sense? One way to think about this, here's a different way. Let me elaborate in one different direction. As you know, a guiding metaphor in almost all of Buddhist philosophy, right from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta on to the present day, is the idea of path, right? We've got the Eightfold Path, we've got the Bodhisattva path, we've got the path of purification, we've got the Tantric path, we've got the graduated path, we got lots of paths, right? Buddhism's all about paths. It's not about where you are, it's about where you're going and how you're going to get there. It's partly about where you are, but it's mostly about where you're going and how to get there. And you can find path structure almost any place in Buddhist literature. And if you think about path from the Yogacara perspective, it's a path to this deeper understanding of the structure of experience. And so the starting point is a place where we're parakalpifying, where we're imagining, where we're projecting, and understanding and eliminating that projection in the parinishpada is kind of the end point of the path. But the kind of substance of the path is in the paratantra. Does that make sense? Is that a helpful elaboration, or should I try to do this in a different metaphor or a different way? Are we okay? Okay. This is hard stuff, by the way, but this isn't the only time we're going to encounter it. That is, this is our first pass, and we're going to be reading a whole treatise on the three natures later on. This is just the first introduction. So I don't expect it all to be crystal clear now, but I also don't want it to be obscure. I want us to kind of see these fundamental ideas that are developing. And I also want you to see, this is kind of close to my heart, that paying careful attention to the language and careful attention to the metaphors will help us a lot in understanding what's going on. Lots of really great Buddhist literature is highly metaphorical. And spending time with the metaphors and understanding their richness and understanding how they interlock is part of understanding the big picture. And so now we're seeing a place where a couple of different metaphors interlock, and that's kind of nice. Okay? Any questions? I'm going to pause for a minute. It's a good pause point. Okay. I've got a few questions in the Q&A. Let me talk about those. Can breathe. Jay's not going to pontificate for much longer. He's going to answer some questions, and then I'll go back to pontificating in a minute. So Taryn asks, does this mean that the consummate nature is not discovered as some kind of fundamental truth? I think the nice way to put that is the word you want to get rid of is discovered. It's consummated. It's as constructed as anything else, but it's a better construction than parakalpita. It's something that we do. Rashika asks a very good question. Is the middle construction, that is the Paratantra, just pure cognition devoid of imputed ideas? Wait till we get there. We're going to get there, I promise. The just is probably wrong, but we're going to get there. Tupten Losong asks, if the second is the focal point of the first and third, does that reify the second? That is a wonderful, wonderful question. And I'm again going to say, let's see if that's true once we get to the adumbration. I don't think that it does. I think what it does is that it gives the second a very specific place in the analysis, but without reification. But that's a really interesting question. And Je Tsongkhapa thinks about this question very hard in Lekshe Ningpo. And he also comes to a negative conclusion about that, but he worries a little bit about reifying the consummate, and then argues that that's probably not there either. So we'll think about this as we go. But that Tupten Losong Lai is an excellent question, and I'd like you again to hold that because I want there to be more stuff on the table before we go about addressing it. We don't quite have everything out there yet. Any other question? Yes, Tupten Chirana. Oh, you're muted. You need a microphone.
Okay.
Now you're good.
Okay, you can hear. So when you
Talking to the
say
ball.
that the consummate is
Yep.
something else that our mind has constructed, what do you mean?
Okay, what I mean by that is that the consummation or completion, right? I mean, think about that word in Tibetan, yang drup, something's been drooping, right? Something's got to be accomplished or done or finished. What we're looking at is understanding that has been accomplished. So that too is something, and this is just so powerful, such a powerful idea in Yogacara. It's something the mind has done. It's not somehow a self-existent thing that we find and stumble on. And I'm going to come back to this idea that I mentioned in passing maybe about an hour ago, and maybe it's time to recur to it. This is Jay's analysis of primal confusion. This is the bumper sticker version of it, right? That primal confusion, Timuk, is confusing something that you made with something that you found. You think that you look around and you just find a world, and you just find yourself, and you find the relationship between subject and object. And in fact, it turns out that you've constructed it. And an enormous amount of Yogacara thought is devoted to really trying to show us how we construct what we thought we just found. Now, it's really easy. I think it'll be really easy for us to convince ourselves that we construct the imagined nature.
Mhm.
It's a much bigger ask and a much deeper insight to see that we've constructed the consummate nature as well.
What do you mean by construct?
That is that realizing the consummate nature, consummating our understanding, is itself a cognitive achievement. We're not looking for a thing that we see outside of us as subject and object. The consummate nature is not an object for a subject. Rather, consummation is something that we accomplish. Mm-hmm. That's a hard idea. You know when we're going to get that idea to come into focus? We're going to get that idea to come into focus in the last few verses of Trisvabhava Nirdesha, when we look at that elephant analogy in really closely, and then look at the idea in the end of Trisvabhava Nirdesha that when there's no object, there's also no mind. Yes.
I have an objection to this because in chapter 4, the first
Yep.
4 chapters is talking about the ultimate, which is the thoroughly or the consummate nature.
Yep.
And the Buddha says that the ultimate is not produced from causes and conditions, it's not compounded. And he says whether Tathagatas arise or do not arise, because phenomena abide in permanent time, and
Yep.
so on. The sphere of reality of phenomena alone abides. So
That's right.
I think he's saying it's always there.
Yes, but that's not the consummate nature itself in terms of the three natures. That I'm going to ask you to hold on to that. You're absolutely right, but we've got to look at this from two very different perspectives. One is to be looking, what you're looking at is actually a description of the Dharma Dhatu, of the sphere of reality. And that's right, that reality itself is free of these superimpositions. And among those superimpositions are causal superimpositions, conceptual superimpositions, even impositions of existence and non-existence. That's right. But when we talk about the consummate nature as the Yongdup, as the Paranishpada, what we're talking about is accomplishing or consummating our vision of that. And that's something that we do, not something that pre-exists.
Where did you get that interpretation from? Is that your thought, or is it from a commentary you read, or?
That interpretation comes from paying attention to the grammar, and then from paying attention to the account that we're going to get in Trisvabhava Nirdesha. And you're going to see that in Trisvabhava Nirdesha, that's going to come out crystal clear. And there's a reason that these are grammatically where they are.
It's quite different than the traditional explanation.
I agree. On the other hand, the person with whom I studied this text was Geshe Geshe Tapka, and it's not this text, but Trisvabhava Nirdesha, and it's the reading that we got when we were reading Trisvabhava Nirdesha. Yeah. So yes, I'm going to ask you to think about these in terms of that particular, that really important grammatical point here, and looking at this very fundamental role that the dependent nature has. By the way, you're also going to find textual support for this in Lecture Nimpo, when Tsongkhapa is talking about the dependent nature and talking about the two faces of the dependent nature, the respect in which on the one hand it's conventional, because it's causes and conditions, and on the other hand, because it can be the object of a consummate understanding or a purified understanding, it can be thought of as ultimate. So we're going to see all of this work out in that way, I promise. Now, I've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A, but let me first prioritize more questions or follow-ups or challenges from the Abbey itself. Do you want to continue this particular line right now? Or do you want to wait? You're welcome to.
Well, wait.
Okay. So I really want to be clear when we talk about the three natures. We're very much talking about that as the three natures of objects of experience. That's why we're talking, when we use that term Chittamatra, we're talking about the objects as we experience them and looking at the structure of the experience that makes that possible. And we can think of the consummate nature as that cognitive experience that makes awakening and the ability to see those characteristics of the Dharma Dhatu possible. That's an achievement, not a pre-existent. That's the point that's being made. Now, Rashika Stevens asks, is afterthought synonymous with consummate nature? No. Consummate nature, as we're going to see, is the nature of things as they are completely understood, or the complete understanding of those things. Subhansh asks, does a yogi on the path of seeing experience the consummate nature? One expects so, absolutely. And the third, can I explain the apple with the three natures? I will, that was my next plan. And B asks, if consummated nature is what we consummated, then how is it truly existent? Answer, it's not. That is the idea that there's something that's truly existent in Yogacara. I want you to put that aside. That's what I really want you to problematize. I know that Yogacara is often presented as treating that some things are truly existent and therefore not as sophisticated as Madhyamaka. I want you to put that idea aside. You might come back to that idea later, but I want you to hold out the possibility that Yogacara is not Mahayana for dummies. It's not reifying the consummate. And I think that is something I'm going to want to try to show you, that we can read Yogacara as not as a reification of the consummate. I think that's really important.
So you're saying that the consummate nature is something dependent that is produced by causes and conditions because it's something our mind does to the objects. It's something that's realized. So then the consummate nature is not permanent. It's not the final nature of reality.
It is, let me work through, as I was asked, to the apple in that respect, and that might answer this question. But here's what I do want to say. It comes about through causes and conditions because it's a consummation. But like nirvana, when we talk about nirvana as unconditioned, what we mean is that when nirvana is achieved, it doesn't depend upon causes and conditions. We don't mean that there are no causes and conditions of attaining nirvana.
Yeah.
Similarly,
attaining nirvana and nirvana are two different things.
Excuse me?
Attaining nirvana and nirvana are two different.
That's right. That's right.
But
Consummation.
You're saying the consummate nature is attaining the consummate, is attaining nirvana. You're saying it's a process, it's a causal process.
I'm saying that it's the result of a process. Consummation, having been consummated, is the apprehension of something that is the end of a process.
Yeah, but nirvana is permanent. It's the end of that process, but it's permanent.
and the consummate nature is as well. The consummate nature is permanent.
You just said it was produced through causes and conditions.
As is nirvana. That is, a nirvana is produced by causes and conditions, but it is not dependent on causes and conditions.
It's not produced by causes and conditions. The process of attaining nirvana is a causal process, but nirvana is not produced by causes.
Well, different ways to say that, but nirvana is a cessation. And cessations are produced by causes and conditions.
No.
Yes. Nirvana itself, when attained, doesn't depend on causes and conditions. Similarly, the consummate, once attained, doesn't depend on causes and conditions, but consummation does. So when I think about the apple, and now we're going to work our way into the natures in a minute. When I think about the apple, and I see it in front of me, it presents itself as something that's got its own redness, that's different from my subjectivity, that's an object that exists intrinsically, that has all of these characteristics. That's the imagined nature. I imagine it through the rubric of subject-object duality. I imagine it through independence. I imagine it through reification. I imagine that my own sense faculties deliver the apple to me just as it is. That's the imagined nature of the apple. And it really does look that way to me. And that, I think, is an important phenomenological fact. For me, I look at that apple, I see something external to and different from my mind. On the other hand, when I think about how that's coming to be, and again, nothing mystical, nothing metaphysical, just thinking causally. What's really happening? Well, light is bouncing off of the apple. It's entering my eye. It's being refracted through a jelly and turned upside down, hitting the back of my retina, causing electrochemical reactions in photoreceptors, sending electrical impulses up neurons, 2 different paths to the back of my brain, and a bunch of electrical activity. That's what the perception of the apple actually is. There's nothing red about that. There's nothing sweet about that. There's nothing round about that. There's nothing external about that. There's nothing dualistically related to me about that. There's just a complicated causal process. So the apple, the perception of the apple I perceive in its dependent nature, is just a complicated set of psychophysical and physical causal processes, nothing more than that. I imagine that to be a red round thing, but there is no red round thing literally in my mind or in my brain. If there was a big red round thing in my brain, I'd probably be dead right now. That would be a tumor or something. The red round thing is something that I create, that I imagine, that I paraculpify as a result of a bunch of neurochemical processes. So the dependent nature of the apple is just the fact that there's a series of complicated psychophysical conditions. The imagined nature is there's an independent object external to me. Now, the canonical definition of the consummate nature, which is complicated to say in English, but is a little bit clearer in Tibetan and Sanskrit, is the emptiness of the dependent of the imagined, or the fact that the dependent nature is empty of the imagined nature. That is, when I recognize that those psychophysical processes are empty of subject-object duality, are empty of independence, are empty of externality, are emptiness of sweet, round, hard objects, are empty of all of those things, that there's nothing but dependent causal processes, empty of everything that's superimposed. That's the consummate nature. The consummate nature of the apple is the fact that all of that stuff that I experience and imagined is merely produced through imputation, through imagination, and isn't there in and at the apple itself. Now, the complicated point, and the point that's going to keep us occupied for a while as we think about Yogacara, is that the apple I experience, that is the apple that I buy at the shop or pick from the tree, put on my desk and eat after this lecture, that apple has all 3 of those natures. They are all equally co-present there. If it weren't a round, red, sweet thing outside of my mind, it wouldn't be an apple. After all, if you go to the orchard or the shop and you say, I'd like a round, red, sweet thing that's really just a bunch of psychophysical processes and not an external apple, they're going to say, we don't have any of those here. What we have are external apples. So the imagined nature of the apple is a real nature of the apple I experience. The dependent nature is also every bit a real nature of the apple I experience. We know that Psychology, optics, physics tells us all of that. There's nothing surprising about that. And Buddhist philosophers long ago recognized that the apple I experience is this complex of psychophysical processes. And we also know, this is the consummate nature, that the apple is, those psychophysical processes, those non-dual processes are empty of the duality and the externality that we have in the imagined nature. Holding those three things together is what gives us an understanding of the apple that we experience. Those are the three natures of the apple. So when we look at the way that that's put at the beginning of the 6th chapter, whatever the imagined nature is, whatever is conventionally designated. Therefore, whatever is designated and as the nature of objects through the use of words, all the things we can describe, all the things we can think about the apple, that's the imagined nature, and it comes from designation, cognitive designation, verbal designation, sensory designation. The dependent nature is just the dependent origination of phenomena. It's the fact that what we have in our experience is nothing but the consequence of innumerable psychophysical conditions. The consummate nature, the reality of phenomena, the Tibetan Deshini, the Sanskrit tatata, the way things are, the actual way the apple is, having been diligent, having understood properly, notice the past participle there, right? It's having been diligent, having understood. It's what bodhisattvas established through meditation and realization, and what they established that leads them to complete awakening. That is it's the established nature. That's the participle. And that's the recognition of the absence of the imagined in the dependent. Tomorrow, what we're going to do is to begin by looking at the metaphors and analogies that lead us to understand this. And by working through the metaphors, I think we're going to get a tighter understanding of exactly how these three natures interlock in each simple object. And we'll begin tomorrow with questions. I see there's already one question from Sagar, but it's a little bit late to push that question. What I want to do is pause at this point and say tomorrow we're going to begin with the analogies, the analogy of the floaters and the analogy of the clear crystal, and to talk about why it is that understanding each of these three natures is essential to understanding not only experience, but to understanding why it is that the objects of experience are empty of intrinsic identity. And that's going to be the task for tomorrow morning. Then we'll try to move into chapter 7. Cool? Cool. See you all tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their sufferings. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.